Well, good morning, guys. It's Pastor Andy. Today's April the 30th, and we're looking at Psalm chapter 77 together. Psalm 77 is a companion psalm that goes along with Psalm 74. It was written by a later Asaph, not the one we read about in the times of David and Solomon. This is one who was a worship leader later on in the nation of Israel, about the time when Israel and Jerusalem and the temple fell to the Babylonians. So this is a tough time in the nation of Israel. I mean, a really tough time. And we read that as we go through this chapter, looking at what Asaph has said. He says, and I want you to notice the personal pronouns as we start this chapter and see who Asaph's eyes were actually on. I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long, I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for his help. I mean, he's praying here, Asaph is. This is a time where he's turning to God, but his focus is not really on God. His focus is on himself. Verse 4, you don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. And here's one that a lot of times Christians can fall into. He says, I think of the good old days, long since ended, when my nights were filled with joyful songs. I searched my soul and pondered the difference now. You know, he's saying the good old days. You ever hear people talk about the good old days? I remember as a boy sitting with my grandfather, we would go to lunch about once a week. I called him almost every day on my way to church when I was serving in Kentucky, and he was my closest friend in the world. And there were times when he would talk about the good old days. But then as he got older, I'll never forget him telling me one day, he said, Andrew, the good old days, they weren't actually that good. It's funny how as we go through time, that things look differently. Our perspective changes. We forget a lot of the negatives. The nation of Israel did it when they came out of Egypt. Oh, Moses, you brought us here to the Red Sea to get slaughtered when, man, if we could just have the leeks and onions back in Egypt. Back in Egypt, you was a slave. It wasn't that good. So he's focused on the wrong thing. He's focused on himself. But there's a big transition that happens in verse number 11. He said, but when I call to remember, recall all you have done, O Lord, I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. He goes through this time of praying. He goes through a time of remembrance. And then finally there's a transition where he says, hold on, this isn't about me. God, you're the one that's in control. Let me think about all the things that you have done. Looking backwards, but looking at the good old days as to what God did, not how great things were when things were good for me. Because, again, that would be focusing, and he was focusing on himself. And we as Christians, we can fall into that trap where we're just focused on ourselves. Well, I don't like what's happening in the world. Well, you know what? I don't like what's happening in the world right now either, but guess what? I'm not God. Well, I don't like what's happening in my family. Well, I'm sorry, but God has allowed it. And it's a lesson for you to learn. And there's some things there you need to talk to God about it, but not complain about it. Well, I don't like what's happening in the church. Well, guess what? It's not your church. It's his church. So, we've got to get our eyes off of ourselves. There are churches who focus on themselves. Well, I don't like the music. Well, you know what? It's a good thing we weren't worshiping you. I don't like how cold it is, or how warm it is, or how loud it is, or how quiet it is. Well, it was too long. Actually, it was too short. That's the one. You never hear that one. It's usually too long. You never hear people complain, wow, that was a short service. But people always have a complaint because everybody knows how to do everything perfectly because they're focused on themselves. And we've got to get our eyes off of ourselves. And finally, Asaph does that here. But I remember all that you have done, O God. God, look at what you did. He looks up by faith. He says, oh God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? He's looking up to God in faith. Then In verse 16, he starts to look back at how God led the nation of Israel. When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. Man, I love the verbal imagery that Asaph is using here. When they walked up to the Red Sea, the nation of Israel, and Moses lifted his staff in his hands, and God split the Red Sea. I mean, how awesome is that? That's what we call a Red Sea miracle. That's where it comes from. And Asaph says, when we walked up to the Red Sea, God, when you looked at it, when the Red Sea saw you were there, it got scared. Yeah, even things tremble. Who is this that even the wind and the seas obey him? The God we serve is way more powerful than me. The God we serve is way more powerful than you. The God we serve is way more powerful than the circumstances of our life. The God we serve is way more powerful than COVID-19. The God we serve is all powerful. Everything happens because he either allows it, ordained it, or put it in place. He is in control. He has got this. There is a reason for what is happening in your life and in my life. And instead of focusing on ourselves, God, I remember the good old days. Why don't we focus on God? Man, when you showed up, the Red Sea trembled. And focus on him instead of on us. I hope you get in this chapter. There's a lot of good stuff. And until tomorrow, God bless you and have a great day.